Welcome to Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we use trauma responsive practices. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and I'm joined today by one of my students. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Georgia. I'm a second-year criminology major at USF.
Thank you. Today we are going to be talking about, can accountability be fair? So one of the biggest challenges to using trauma responsive practices within the criminal justice system is the pushback that we tend to get from individuals, both within and outside of the system, who really struggle to understand how using trauma responsive practices still maintains accountability. And they claim that we are really just hand-holding or, weakening or softening the justice process because they want justice to be swift, severe, certain. They want it now. They want it to be harsh. And that to them is what justice looks like. But if we use a trauma responsive model to understand justice, we can kind of understand how accountability within that is still maintained and it's fair, not just for victims, but for offenders as well as the community. So when you think about accountability, what is kind of your idea of when you're thinking about some individual going through the system because they've committed something, right?
Mhm.
What does accountability look like?
For accountability, I tend to lean into the ideology that rehabilitation is extremely important
Mm,
into the incarceration process. Because, you have a very certain number of offenders who kind of grow into that lifestyle and are forced into those ways through trauma, through lifestyle, through, forced habits. And it doesn't really help the system if they're just going through prison, through jail, and they're just learning to be,
better at what they do.
yeah,
Right.
learning the stereotypes of prison where they need to be on guard 24/7. It makes more sense to start putting them through the process to unlearn those ways.
And that I think that that's a good place to think about this idea of trauma responsive justice practices, even within the prison. And I think you get a lot of pushback when we start to talk about this in this context, because when we start to reform the correctional system, right? Even the way that people go into and experience prisons, jails too. Um, when you start to reform that using a trauma responsive practice, a lot of people push back and say, we're being too lenient. We're not holding people accountable, right? And when we talk about trauma responsive practices to reform corrections, we're talking about getting rid of bars, right? We're
Mhm.
talking about getting rid of the excessive restriction, right? We're talking about getting rid of the reduction in safety and security, the individual privacy that individuals have. We're talking about giving these individuals their dignity back. And when we talk about giving them their dignity back, we're talking about allowing them to go to the bathroom in private,
Yeah.
allowing them to shower in
Mhm.
private, right? Allowing them to have personal space, right? Allowing them to just be afforded these basic human rights.
Mhm.
And people don't want to hear it. People don't want to hear it at all. They don't want to even entertain this, especially when we talk about the US. When we talk about places like Sweden, Sweden is a really, really good example for trauma responsive reform practices. Their correctional facilities, one, they don't call them that, but they look like dorms. There's shared living space, and then there's personal living space where these
Yeah.
individuals have their own space, their ability to go to the bathroom in private and shower in private. They have safety and security, the ability to lock their own room, right? And in the US justice system, we're not there. We're not close.
No, not even close.
Yeah.
No.
The second you introduce this idea of getting rid of bars, adding carpet and paint, right?
Mhm.
People are like, no.
Yeah, because I've seen the photos of those prison. Well, they don't call them that,
Yeah.
but those places in Sweden, and it's like when they have that surrounding and that environment, they're able to find peace within it
Mhm.
and find solidarity within it and
Yeah.
actually reflect on actions they've made to get there
Yeah.
and really, turn a new leaf.
They're focused on, like, growing instead of surviving because, like, the
Mhm.
the bars there's a lot to be said about, like, environmental design and the built environment and how that impacts and influences individuals in, like, a neurological way,
Yeah.
right? When we don't see green spaces, when we only see bars or we hear the metal clanking, right? It imprints on us in such a way that we're in this constant mode of agitation and fight, flight, freeze. And I can only imagine, individuals that are incarcerated, the amount of fear, right? And the amount of I have to be constantly on guard. And when you remove just those small basic things and you give people things like safety, security, privacy, dignity,
Mhm.
what can they focus on now?
Yeah, not to even mention the fact that, in US prisons, they only see maybe like 15, 30 minutes of sunlight a day.
Oh, yeah.
That's internally just
Oh, the amount of
degrading them.
yeah, and the amount of scientific research and evidence that supports the need that we have for vitamin D that we get directly from the sun
Yeah.
and how it affects our mental health. Like when there is a reduction in that, we suffer mentally, right? And so it does not make sense that we are utilizing things that are not evidence-based, right? We're
Yeah.
saying restrict, 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 do not give them even the small basic things that a human needs because
Mhm.
we want to hold them accountable, right? And we consider this accountability to be the most severe punishment of all. Like punish, 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 strip every bit of humanity, dignity away, take away your security, take away your privacy, take away everything because you did this one thing or these two things or whatever it may have
Mhm.
been, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that seems unfair.
Yeah, because I mean, essentially, you're just putting them in a timeout with like an environment of just people like them. So by
Yeah,
the point, because I mean, inevitably, not everyone's getting, a lifetime,
right.
sentence. They're eventually gonna get out and they're gonna have learned nothing.
Yeah, they're only gonna like resort to the same mode of living, right? Because when they get out, they're not going to something that's necessarily that much better, right? They're going back to these same communities where they were quite literally, having to survive and they're afraid and they're, struggling with poverty and addiction and mental health. And yeah, they have freedom, right, to move about, but they don't, they weren't equipped with any better skill
Yeah.
to evolve, grow, change, move in different directions. It was just reinforced.
Yeah, all they've learned during that time period is just more survival tactics
Mhm.
in a more
Yeah.
defensive manner.
Yeah, it's just a little bit more heightened, I would say, in a correctional setting. And so I think that in order for us to even engage in this idea of accountability being fair, we have to really challenge what our idea of accountability is and what it looks like, but also what fairness looks like. Because I
Mhm.
think that we would both argue right now the system is unfair, that
Yeah.
punishment is unfair. It's
Mhm.
unfair for everybody, even the victim, right? The victim that goes through with, the process of the justice system, they're re-traumatized
Mhm.
throughout the entire process themselves, right?
Mhm.
From initial point of contact all the way through the end. And a lot of victims simply like don't want to engage any further because one, they don't feel like they're getting justice, right? And two, it's a very traumatizing process. The
Yeah.
the constant questioning, the constant reiteration and reliving, right? The lack of transparency within the system. There's
Yeah.
not communication about what's going on, and even if they do, it doesn't line up with what actually does go on, what does happen.
Yeah, and you can see that especially in women victims and in rape
Mhm.
victims and things like that.
Yeah.
that's constantly reliving and constantly being interviewed and interrogated, and even, having photos taken, having a rape kit taken on you, of just constantly reliving that experience.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's definitely better ways that we could go about collecting that information. And I think the justice system will argue, oh, well, we have to do this to document. We have to do this to understand. We have to do this to investigate. But do you really have to do it so many times? Right? Can we not do it once and then use that testimony
Mhm.
throughout? Right? And a lot of the process ends up alienating the victim, making them feel like they're on trial, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of victim blaming, even in the questioning, even in the process. And I think that we do that, you know, as a society. We always ask those questions. Well, what did you do to contribute to your own victimization?
Yeah, you see that a lot, and especially in media.
Mm,
I I I hate the way media portrays most, cases, because they
yeah.
always try to look for reasonings why, they
Hmm.
out information that shouldn't technically or need to be outed.
Yeah.
They always go above and beyond to figure out the victim and
Yeah.
what put them in that scenario.
Oh, yeah, like, even if you think of something, like, as mundane as, like, a car burglary, right? They left their car unlocked.
Mhm.
That's their reason why it happened, and it's like, that's victim blaming,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
We should be able to live in a world where we can leave our things out.
Yeah.
And it's not a free for all, right? We shouldn't have to, right? We're thinking about it wrong by thinking, well, you got robbed because you didn't lock your car doors, or you didn't lock your house, or you got raped because, well, you were wearing a revealing outfit, right? We're not
Mhm.
walking advertisements,
No.
right? The default should be don't violate, right? And we just get in this practice of the victim did something wrong for
Yeah.
this to happen to them, right?
Mhm.
Even people will say, well, they were asking for that. You left your car unlocked, so you were asking for it. Really? Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I remember seeing this. I don't really know how to describe it, as more of like an art exhibit or like a museum, but they took the outfits that women were wearing when they were assaulted, raped, and it just kept getting more and more atrocious, because it went from, a woman who was wearing a dress to church, and it went all the way down to just a baby wearing a diaper.
Hmm.
And it was just a diaper, and just, I was wearing this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and that's the thing, that a lot of times when we hear about, like, rape victims specifically, they want to highlight, like, what they were wearing, and oftentimes they only do that in cases where maybe it was revealing. Like, you almost never hear about a case where a woman was raped and she was wearing a burqa, right?
no.
But it happens,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And even the idea of, like, a baby wearing a diaper, like, you know, it's not the clothes that caused it, right? And we still fixate, even not the media, right?
Yeah.
Even everyone else, like, you'll even see people that just post a picture, right, of something, and they're wearing something revealing, and you'll hear people in the comments, oh, they're asking to get raped. And it's like, we're
Why did
not,
you think that?
right, we're not advertisements, right?
Yeah.
So I think that we as individuals have to hold our own selves accountable too, for the things that we do that contribute to the ways that we think about people who offend, people who are victims, the system, and all of those things. But when we're talking about this idea that can accountability be fair, I think that that depends on what our definition of accountability is.
Mhm.
Like, when I think about accountability, I think it is something that occurs when people step up and take responsibility for what they've done,
Yeah.
like, on a basic level.
Mhm.
And they say, like, yes, I did this, right? And then they're able to follow through with whatever the consequences of that are. And that to me is where we really have to break down like the fairness aspect. What are the consequences for this? What does this act necessitate
Yeah.
consequence wise, right?
Yeah. It begs the question where it was like, where it's, should it be mandatory for offenders to pick out maybe 2 or 3 um, rehabilitation programs that they need to complete during their incarceration to at least prove, to one, find interesting things that they would want to reflect on or that they might be actually interested in, and then to actually have proof um, and evidence that, they did something.
Yeah. And I think that even when we talk about like consequences, not everything, in my opinion, almost no crimes really should have a consequence of incarceration, right? The things that I would say necessitate incarceration are these individuals that are really an extreme danger to society,
Hmm.
right? To the point where it is in our best interest to secure them in a facility to go through that rehabilitative process. I think that almost all acts you could hold people accountable and give them consequences in society, right?
Hmm.
And I think that your idea about like choosing rehabilitative programs, like if we even expanded that and think about it in the context that I'm saying, like incarceration should be a last resort of consequence, right? It should not be the default, which it
Hmm.
is.
Yeah.
Incarceration is the default. Give them time. And is that really a consequence, right? Are you learning your lesson about using drugs or stealing or, getting in a fight or not paying your child support or, whatever, are you
Yeah.
really learning, growing, rehabilitating, reflecting by being incarcerated?
Yeah, I mean, I had a cousin. He was charged on counts of drug possession, drug dealing, of fentanyl and weed, and he was charged. He had spent 3 years in jail because he still had not gotten an actual trial date, and by the end of those 3 years, he had actually passed away due to overdosing on fentanyl in the system.
Yeah.
Because he just sat there with nothing better to do,
Yeah.
no rehabilitation, no chance of parole, house arrest, nothing. Just sat in a cell in a jail for 3 years.
Yeah. And the thing is like we are putting these individuals that are all struggling with something,
Hmm.
right, in close proximity to each other, right? There's not, rehabilitation is not happening.
It's not.
It's not. Growth is not happening. Reflection is not happening. In fact, everything that you've known and done is being congratulated, reinforced. It's, patting your ego, right?
Hmm.
Because we're talking about these individuals that are struggling with a lot of things. And so for me, incarceration should not be the default. In fact, it should be very rare circumstances that we incarcerate people, and we should really funnel money into, a lot of people call like, let's defund the police. I think we should defund corrections.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, defund corrections and put all of that money into programs that really do help people. And I'm talking about really big, holistic, wraparound programs that pull people out of these communities that they're offending in and provide them with a very intense type of program that helps them grow and evolve, right?
Hmm.
You said reflect, and I think that that's a huge aspect of
Yeah.
accountability. I think reflection is what people need to really kind of engage in that accountability process. But I think that that's what's fair.
Yeah. I'm part of the conduct board here on the university, and part of our job is once we see to a trial, and we identify whatever they must do to correct their, for punishment, for lack of better terms, we can assign them to write a 3-page essay about, how they've reflected on this. We can assign a program that they need to complete that shows that they've learned from this. Um, all to make sure that we're doing the correct steps that we need to do to make sure they don't do it again.
Hmm. Yeah. And that's the thing I think that's really rehabilitative, right?
Hmm.
That really is holding people accountable when they're able, because you can send someone to prison and say, do X number of years.
Hmm.
And you can, ignorantly think that they're going to be a different person when they come out, right? Having no expectations of them. And they will quite literally just survive as anyone, right?
Yeah.
As anyone would, and get out and continue along their path. But if you force them to really think about what happened, how their, choices contributed to that and their actions contributed to that, and what the impact was on the individuals in the community, and really engage them in that process, not just write this, but really engage in this long restorative reflective practice. Those are the individuals that are going to actually experience some type of accountability and rehabilitation.
Yeah.
And those are the people that are going to go on. You're almost never going to have somebody go through that reflective process and go, yeah, I'm good with what I did. I don't have any issues with it.
Hmm. Yeah, because if they have to go through the program for 2 months, 3 months, that's enough time for them to actually um, start a process and a routine within themselves. So when they go back out into society, they're able to keep up that routine. Because you see so many inmates who finally get released from their sentence and they still do, like, the hover of their food when they go and
Hmm.
eat, or just like they tidy up their bed because, that's what
Hmm.
they had to do.
Yeah.
So actually making sure that they're doing this and they create a new routine that's actually reflective and based off of their sentencing or the program that they had to do, that's starting them off on a good base to when they re-enter society, they're like, let me keep this up. This is what I'm doing. This is what I like doing. This
Hmm.
is, my new lifestyle.
When you mention that, I'm thinking like that is easy to do in isolation, right? All of those things like your routine, that's easy to do in isolation. And then when these individuals go back into the world and all of the other people around them are not, it's really challenging, right? If they don't have the
Hmm.
skills, right? But I like this idea that you mentioned about like the program, like months long, because if you think about it, like we sentence people to years and years and years
Yeah.
and nothing changes, right? But it only takes a few months in a college classroom for students to grow, right?
Hmm.
For them to become different, even if it's a small difference, right? But if you watch college students when they come in and when they leave, these people have grown so much through that process, right? And if you can think about, say you sentence someone to 10 years in prison and instead give them a sentence of 4 years of a program, right?
Hmm.
How much change and growth, right? If you also preface that with, you're going to do 4 years, but you're going to be in the community and you're going to participate in this program, you're going to have your freedom. I think that anybody would be able to be happy with that in terms of like the individuals that are being held accountable, right?
Yeah.
Accountable.
Hmm.
I think that we just have to evolve as a society on what we mean when we say consequence, punishment, accountability. What does that look like?
Yeah. 100%. Because, I mean, like you said, if they get sentenced to 10 years, all they're learning throughout that decade is to how can I become the top dog? How do I
Yeah.
assert my dominance? How do I make sure no one messes with me?
Yeah.
You know, and when they're in a program for 4 years or even just a year, they're being humbled, basically. They're being
Yeah.
humbled. They're being told, like, no, that's not what you do. This is the correct steps, while also getting the support so they don't feel bad for it. I mean, reflective, you know, you need to
Yeah.
feel bad. You need to have the empathy, but they're not locking themselves away of,
It's like they're not being stigmatized.
yeah.
So that process of being incarcerated, right, in and being a convicted, right, person, it's very stigmatizing. And
Mhm.
when you spend enough time hearing from this system on how bad or horrible or inferior or whatever animalistic you are, and then you internalize this and that stigma, right? Versus going into this program where you're able to be a free human and you're not getting that messaging all of the time, but rather in this program, you're being told you are a human. You have, you make mistakes, you have needs, these are valid, and helping them through that process, right, avoids that
Mhm.
stigmatization and the internalization that occurs. It also avoids institutionalizing these individuals, right? And that's the thing is some individuals become institutionalized and they never become deinstitutionalized.
Yeah, because then part of that stigma is then once they get released, that's permanently on their record. So then they can't get an actual job to make ends meet. So then they're falling back into the same routines of what did make ends meet for them, whether that
Yeah.
be drug possession or, you know, being a prostitute, whatever it may be.
Like if we were to go about reforming the way that we go about holding people accountable, right? Change the consequences. Remove prison and jail as like the default. It's the exception. It's the last resort. And we even think about reforming the conviction record, right? And I'm thinking like, now it's like felony, misdemeanor,
Hmm.
like violations, like these things come up, and even the types of offense, like if, it'll come back third degree felony, this, whatever, or battery or domestic violence, whatever it may be. If we think about reforming this whole process where the conviction doesn't come back, but maybe we're aware that they're in X program, right? So a background check reveals, well, this individual is a part of the, X rehabilitation program. Oh, this individual is a part of this rehab. They don't know what level offense you were convicted of or charged with. They don't know what type of offense it was. They just know that you are participating in a rehabilitation program, right?
Hmm.
And then we think differently about consequence so that it goes into these different programs. And these programs are tied to whatever type of offense, right? Um, if we reformed our system into that type of system, and that when an employer saw or a rental company landlord saw, right, or whatever entity saw, oh, they're in these types of programs, one, I know that they're a justice involved individual, but two, now I'm mandated to accommodate their participation in that, meaning they have to go, say, for example, rehabilitation program X, they have a Tuesday, Thursday session they
Hmm.
have to be in, right? And now, as the employer, I've hired you, I have agreed that you don't have to be here during those time periods, that you can be at that.
Yeah.
What if we did that? Do you think that, like, one, that's doable?
I think it's doable in a sense where it's going to be very slow.
Yeah, like an iterative process.
Yeah, because then you beg the question of what are we going to do with all the people that we already have incarcerated, which are, you know, hundreds, thousands, millions. And then what are we going to do with the people that we have consistently incoming? So then you have the question of, okay, how are we going to rearrange the funding to make more money for all the programs while still meeting the bare expectations for the correction centers, for food and whatever they need to be. And then another question is, if then we start shutting down prisons, if we slowly start getting all these inmates out and into programs, what's going to happen with the influx of jobs needed for the program and the decrease of needed correctional officers? Are they going to transition into the rehabilitation programs?
Ideally, I would think no,
Mhm.
just because the nature of the program requires different people.
Yeah.
So you do bring up good points. Like, we have to account for one, if we are no longer sending individuals to a correctional facility, then at some point we're going to have to shut down correctional facilities
Mhm.
and lay people off. So, one, what do we do with that facility now that it's an empty building, right?
Well, a different idea is to repurpose the closing facilities into homeless shelters.
Yeah, I definitely think that we could find a way to like repurpose the facilities. I think that our greater challenge is, what do we do with this workforce, right? We're laying off all of these individuals.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I would say there's probably somewhere in the labor market that could handle them. There's a lot of jobs.
Yeah.
There's jobs. I think that there's also a lot of people that would want to work in these rehabilitative programs. And if you think about like creating these alternative programs, you're going to have people that want to do that work. I think the greatest challenge might be just buy-in and commitment, because like as you mentioned, like it would have to be like an iterative process. And I even think that
Mhm.
we would have to do like a pilot, like pilot this program in one area and
Yeah.
see how well it works to be able to build support for other jurisdictions to buy into it. I don't think that we would ever get like we w- I don't think that we would be able to start with like a national mandate, like this is the way we're going to go about it, right?
Yeah.
Because like first of all, on a federal level, they have very little involvement in this process, right? It's really state and local governments. And so it would really have to take one local area that would buy into this, that would begin to build it and build the support and the evidence for it, go through the entire, like all of the iterations, and then be able to like sell this, right? But,
Yeah.
build support for other jurisdictions to model it. But I definitely think that that's the direction we should go, right? We've had this idea that accountability is the most important, right? Hold people accountable for their actions.
Yes.
And accountability means punishment, and punishment means loss of freedom.
Mhm.
Like that is the direction of that relationship that we've had. But when we start talking about using trauma responsive practices and really like building the humanity back into these individuals,
Mhm.
incarceration and punishment are not the focus. Accountability is still important and it is still the focus, but accountability looks like healing,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
That to me, I think, is the answer. I think accountability can be fair, but fair for whom, right? Who are we talking about? And we really are talking about everybody.
Yeah.
And specifically the community at large, because what we're doing now is we're talking about holding individuals accountable for the things that they do, getting justice for the victim, and the community suffers.
Mhm.
When you remove these individuals from homes, it is not just impacting that one individual. It
Yeah.
impacts their family, their husbands, their wives, their sisters, their mothers, their children, their their entire family, but it also impacts the community, because when we remove them from the community, What happens? Well, they're not the source of income for their family. So now their family has reduced income. They're having to rely more on government assistance and programs, right?
Mhm.
The removal of that individual from the job labor market puts strain on it, because we're not talking about one individual. We're talking about a very large amount of people. We incarcerate more people than any other country in the world.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking about millions of people, right? And so we are straining the community, right? And when these individuals go in to be held accountable, right, and they're punished, we have this expectation that when they come out, that they will be rehabilitated, that they
Yeah.
won't do this again. But that's not the truth,
Even though they've just like sat in a cell.
right?
Yeah.
This is very indication of a broken system. And what happens is they reoffend again because the system is broken, because they're coming back out into the same system. It's just cyclical, right?
Yeah.
So the community is being harmed repeatedly, along with these individuals, their families, and the victims, right? But if we start to talk about accountability more broadly, and that consequence does not have to mean incarceration, right?
Mhm.
We'll get to a place where these individuals begin to heal using trauma responsive practices and reforming our system. We'll get to a place where these individuals are not repeating the same things,
Yeah.
and the community will heal too.
Exactly. And when they're in the communities and they're doing these rehabilitation methods, they're also proving to other members of the community that it works.
Yeah. And it's showing that accountability can be fair. Accountability, can exist without
Mhm.
incarceration, without this strict, loss of freedom.
Yeah, and being able to kind of be a guiding light within the community from that point on of this is what's working for me.
Mhm.
And even maybe having the possibility of making these programs open to other members of the, same community
Mm.
if they want, to turn a new leaf.
Yeah. So, like, you're talking about prevention,
Mhm.
right? So, not just having this as, like a post intervention, right? But we're talking about prevention. So, allowing individuals to self select and say, hey, I'm really struggling with things. And if I don't get it together, I could, like, go down the wrong path. I would like to participate in this program. I think that's an amazing idea.
Yeah, because I mean, so if you were to have a father and a son, and the father was incarcerated, but now he has access to this program, and he sees his son going down the same path, and the son is maybe underage, maybe 16, he should be able to be like, okay, you're going to do this program with me.
I agree. And even if we think about the design of this program, I think that it would definitely need to have a component embedded into it that the family was involved. And you could even pull in some aspects where, community members could be involved or the victim could be involved. I think there's a lot that can be done to build this program. But I think that this is, the step in really working on rehabilitation. And I agree. I think that accountability can be fair, and it just needs to be, like I said before, fair for whom, right?
Hmm.
Because most of the time, all we're ever focused on is holding the offender accountable and justice for the victim,
Yeah.
right? But we rarely engage on what we mean when we say justice. What does justice look like? And we rarely engage with this idea of what is accountability, right? Because generally our definition of accountability is this loss of freedom,
Hmm.
right? That's it. But I think that we would both agree accountability can be fair and it can be trauma responsive, and it does not have to end in incarceration. That doesn't have to
100%.
be the consequence.
Hmm.
Well, thank you. I think this was an awesome conversation. You're watching Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we talk about trauma responsive practices and criminal justice reform.